Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this joint Audit and Standards Committee. I'm Councillor John Matheson, and I'm chairing the meeting today. May I first of all remind you of some domestic arrangements. Please ensure that microphones are turned off when not in use, that you do not interrupt other speakers, that if you are attending the meeting to speak and persistently interrupt, you may be asked to leave. Please ensure your mobile phones are on silent or switched off. There is a £10 fine for anybody that breaches that. It goes to the Chair's charities. It's not been reminded of that recently, but it will be a thing in this committee, okay? Additionally, we will be using e-voting for this meeting on the modern.gov app. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, you will be deemed by the Council to have consented to being filmed. By entering this meeting as a speaker, you are also consenting to being recorded by the Council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. The Council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and the press are not lawfully excluded. In attendance this morning, we have officers Arthur Charvonia, Chief Executive, and for these purposes the returning officer. We have Melissa Evans, Director of Corporate Resources, Jan Robinson, Deputy Monitoring Officer, Bob Palmer, Corporate Manager, Finance, Commissioning and Procurement. We have Committee Officer Bethany Webb and quite a team trying to get over the difficulties of this morning. And we also have a guest. We welcome David Green from Arling Close. Right. Moving to the agenda. Apologies for absence and substitutions.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillor Austin Davies and Councillor Bryn Harron, and we have Councillor John Wyman substituting. Thank you.
Right, do we have any declarations of pecuniary and non-pecuniary interest by members? Right, good. Right, moving on to confirming the minutes of the meeting held on the 31st of July. Anybody got any points on accuracy? No? Someone like to propose and second that? Thank you, thank you. Right, on to the vote.
Thank you, Chair. That vote is now in progress on ModGov. Thank you, Chair. That is 8 votes for and 1 abstention, so that is carried.
Right, the minutes have been confirmed. Next, to receive notification of any petitions in accordance with the Council's petition scheme.
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Have we any questions by the public?
None received, Chair.
Do we have any questions from councillors?
None received, Chair.
Right. Right, we move on to the first main item on the agenda, which is to invite the Chief Executive to introduce the report to the committee on the Elections Review Draft Action Plan.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, councillors. So, as councillors will be aware, this is very much part 2 of this report, in the sense that I brought a report to both full councils earlier in the year, and as per the recommendations that came to full council, one of those was that the draft action plan come to JASC for you to review that draft action plan. So as I say, this is very much part 2. You'll be pleased to know I don't intend to take you through line by line the 3 pages of the action plan starting on page 47. But I would just say a couple of things, I suppose, in terms of other progress over and above what's in the action plan. And then I suspect my colleagues to my left may want to say a couple of things, and then we're happy to take questions. So just in terms of broader progress, so ahead of this meeting, we met last week with the Electoral Commission, who, as you can imagine, we've stayed in regular contact with throughout, all the way since May, and who we would have regular contact with anyway through the course of normal occurrences. We took them through this specific action plan, and they are, broadly speaking, happy with the progress that we've made. What we've also invited them to do, and I'm pleased to say that they've accepted, is that they join our project board meetings. So we have currently monthly project board meetings. Those will increase in frequency as we head towards next scheduled or any unscheduled elections. And so they're happy to take part and be part of that project board, which I hope will give additional resilience and governance to our process, which is a good thing. The other change is Jan Robinson, you're obviously familiar with. Jan has been providing support both herself and her team, so lending her team on an ad hoc basis to help the elections team since May, and that's continuing at this point in time. But the lady who you're not familiar with, to her left, is Gillian Fryer. Gillian has joined us initially as the interim corporate manager for elections. I say initially because we're out to recruitment for a direct replacement to that role, a permanent replacement to that role. That advert closes at the end of this week, and we're interviewing next week, I believe it is. So I'm hopeful that we will have a permanent person in post as the elections manager as soon as possible. But in any event, we've commissioned Gillian to stay with us through until May next year, come what may, on the basis that we need, as we know, as is reflected in the 2 reports that we received, we need to add capacity into the elections team as a whole. So Gillian will be providing that additional capacity, currently, as I say, as the manager, and then becoming an election specialist within the team, running through till May. And depending upon when the general election is, we may extend that slightly further. And if you know, please do tell me, because that would be very helpful to know when that is sooner rather than later. But I suspect we're all in the dark as to when the general election will actually be. So that was all I was going to say in terms of the action plan itself and immediate progress since. In terms of the division of roles, so Jan is providing the day-to-day line management for the elections team, so pay and rations, annual leave and those kind of things, and as I say, lending some of her team into the elections team on an ad hoc basis. And then Gillian is providing the project management and elections management within the team, which jointly have helped produce the action plan that you've got in front of you. So if I stop there, Chair, look to my colleagues if there's anything they want to add. If not, happy to take questions as councillors may have.
Thank you. Questions then?
Great, thank you very much. I've combed through the external and internal reviews, and a common feature is the need for adequate and timely forward planning, which is why you've produced the action plan, I guess. I'm slightly concerned that there's an awful lot of amber and red on it at the moment. I don't know when that was actually, what's the word I'm after, audited. I mean, how up-to-date is the action plan itself?
So it's, as far as possible, up to date. It's not old in that sense. So I think for the purposes of today, assume it's as of today. You're right, some things will have moved ever so slightly since. I'm less concerned, I would say, about the amount of amber and red. And the reason I say that is because some of those actions are very specifically relate to district and parish elections. And so what I'm particularly focused on is that we learn the lessons now, while it's still fresh in people's minds, but in terms of implementing those things, we don't need to. In fact, there are other things that are higher priority that we need to implement now in terms of the frequency, in terms of delivery of the action plan. So what you will probably see, and I haven't gone through and checked it from an audit perspective exactly with that question in mind, but I think what you'll probably see is particularly the red actions. They relate to elections that we don't have to run again and won't have to run again for another 4 years or 3.5 years. So that's why they appear in that way. Right now, what we have to prioritise is the delivery of the annual canvass, which is ongoing. the delivery of the changes that government has made around elections more generally. So, for example, from the end of October, in order to be a postal voter, you'll have to apply online. You won't be able to do it in the way that others have previously, and that's a national portal. Those are just examples. We're prioritising that and preparation for the Police and Crime Commissioner elections that we know we've got next May, and equally for the parliamentary that we know we're going to have at least before January 2025, more likely at some point during the calendar year. But you're right, and we won't take our eye off of those other elements as well, because they need to progress at the right time.
Thank you. So, I take your point entirely. My concern is with the general election. Depends on which reporters you read, but it could be as early as November this year. Could be. So if it were called with 25 days notice for November or early December, are we going to be ready?
I think the honest answer is we're never ready if an election is called at 25 days notice. And equally, the other honest answer is we have no choice but to be ready in terms of we have to deliver it. So yes, we will be. The reality is, if it were called today, the impact for the council's resources would be significant, because effectively a whole lot of other things would stop in order to make sure that we could deliver the general election. The other key piece, and you're absolutely right, as you said earlier, that comes through loud and clear through the external report and the internal report, is the need for project management. Ironically, of course, delivery of a parliamentary election in many respects is a lot easier than parish and town council elections. There are far fewer moving parts. There are only a limited number of candidates. It is an easier exercise in that sense, but the scale is bigger because the turnout is higher. And one of the things that we've been, and I didn't mention it in my preamble as it were, but one of the things we've been identifying in the last couple of weeks is a new count venue. Because we know that our count venue at Worcester Park will be closed by Christmas. And so we've had to identify a new place to run the elections from. The last parliamentary we actually delivered in this building. We don't think that was, it was fine, but it's not ideal. And so we've been looking at that. But I think Jill wanted to come in.
I was just going to say that the county election officers have a meeting next month, and that's top of the agenda. So, so we are already organising. Just sort of, and the majority of the staff were on a training on Thursday, which was all about how to cope with a snap general election and cross boundaries, because I mean you all know that the constituency boundaries have changed. So that's one of the topics that we're talking about in October with the county election officers as well. So we've started.
Just for if people haven't spotted it, the new constituency, the revised boundaries for South Norfolk constituency become easier for us because they become coterminous with Baber. So we're not having to give away ballot papers to another area for them to count, or equally not having to take them in. But the other areas that we are likely to be involved in are much more complicated because they involve giving and taking from other areas. And we haven't yet had formal confirmation as to which constituencies we are responsible for administering. I think it's a fair bet and a fairly obvious one that we will be doing South Suffolk, as I say, for obvious reasons. But we are likely to have more constituencies. And obviously, that planning is therefore it's a county-wide exercise, as Jill says.
Yeah, there aren't too many people itching to get in, so one more go.
So I'm really interested in this. So Waveney Valley, which is most of it sits in what was mid-Suffolk, but it's got a bit of South Norfolk. Are we going to be responsible for that?
So formally we don't know. In terms of the proportions, so a small slither of Waveney Valley sits in East Suffolk, and then the balance is in South Norfolk and in mid-Suffolk. Actually, the electorate numbers are something like 400 more electors in South Norfolk rather than in mid-Suffolk. We've been consulted as returning officer by DLUC as to our preferences, and their instinct, just purely based on numbers, was that they were going to give it to South Norfolk. We have proposed, and I say we, I mean me, but also I mean South Norfolk and East Suffolk. We've proposed that becomes a constituency that mid-Suffolk administers, but that's the bit we haven't had confirmation of. So we've said, yes, fine, there's 400 extra, but actually it's so close, and it's in Suffolk predominantly, and therefore we felt it more appropriate that it be administered from Suffolk, not from Norfolk.
Thank you. Further questions? Councillor Patchett, then Councillor Marriott after that.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question about the charges for parish councils. Did we offer any discount to any of the parish councils for sort of perhaps a less than perfect service? And also, did any of them sort of request a discount for the overall services? Thank you.
So we certainly haven't offered any sort of discount, and I'll look to my colleagues to the left as to whether any of them have formally asked for a discount. I'm not aware that they haven't come by me. Lots of shaking of heads.
There we go. I was just wondering, looking at all these actions, there are lots of them required, but have they been prioritised in any way? For example, I'm looking at creating a comprehensive communications plan should an election be called early. I would have thought that hasn't started. I'd have thought that might be one of the priorities.
I have a meeting at the beginning of October with the media team, with Christine and Brad, and that's what we're going to work on.
Can I just come in as well, and just to say that obviously this is week 3 for Jill. So, you know, when we wrote the report, it was sort of week 1.5. So it is, you know, ongoing. We've done lots of work already, but more to come. And there's going to be a more detailed election project plan, which will go to the project board, and we'll detail the milestones, the dates, who it's assigned to. But we just need to work on that. We've already had a sort of morning where we've identified all the tasks that we need to do. We now got to put them into priority order. So, as I say, week 3, but work is ongoing and ongoing fast.
All right. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. I thought the report from the Electoral Services Association was absolutely first class. It was very perceptive and very balanced, and they'd obviously listened to people. But when I went through all the detail, I couldn't find any reference to the senior leadership and management oversight of the Electoral Services Manager and his staff. And I would like to ask who was actually undertaking that. Thank you.
Do you mean now, or do you mean back in May?
I mean back during the... Yes, not now, yes.
In some respects, actually, thinking about it, the answer's the same, but I just thought I'd be clear. So, in terms of line management structures, the elections manager reports into the Director of Law and Governance, so Ifti Ali, who then currently reports into me. There are maybe some other changes that we're going to make around the senior leadership team in the coming months. But the expectation is that that post will report into Director of Law and Governance, which is another post that we're out to advert for at the moment, because as councillors will be aware, Mr Ali is an interim member of staff and leaves us at the end of October, which in and of itself creates a little bit of a risk around delivery of elections, because that would leave a bit of a gap. Similarly, if we think backwards, and without getting into personal details, some councillors will be aware of Mr Ali's personal circumstances, which were difficult at the turn of the year, and so undoubtedly played an element in terms of line management support or lack of line management support for the previous manager.
Can I just ask another question?
Yes, certainly.
Chair, thank you. Do you think there are any lessons for senior management team to learn from this exercise? Thank you.
There are loads. There's 3 pages worth, I would say, and plus some. I think the main one for me is making sure that as we recruit to Jill's permanent post, and equally with Jill in terms of her role, that there is less line management, which may sound like a strange thing to say, but a direct loop into me. That's what I'm familiar with. That's what I'm used to in terms of the elections manager's approach with the returning officer. that clearly there's things they do day to day, and clearly there's a role for line management in terms of, as is described, pay and rations, but more predominantly that they don't feel as though they can't come and talk directly to me where there are issues. I haven't changed my approach, but certainly I can immediately see how that has changed depending on the person who's been imposed.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, Councillor Register.
All right, okay, it's working. A number of elections, for parish elections, were initially declared as uncontested, and then subsequently we discovered they weren't, but quite late in the day, maybe a week after the apparent close of nominations. And people were worried that that might happen again. And the other question was, when we got the costs at Surrey Town Council for the elections, people wanted to know how the costs for an uncontested election are calculated, because we couldn't work it out. And they varied quite, one-member wards, and there were different prices, different costs. That's all.
So I'm happy to take both of those away, because I suspect, looking to my left, that there's not something that my colleagues will be able to answer here and now, unless you feel you can.
If you want to write into us or contact us or tell me which of the parishes you're thinking of, then I can ask the...
But also just to say that it is based on the number of electorate, so they will vary.
And in terms of the statements of persons nominated, clearly that was the main issue that we had during the election. Any other issues, to a large extent, stemmed from there, so fell from there, if you like. And certainly the original statement of persons nominated that was published, I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday, I'm trying to remember now which day of the week, Wednesday I think it was incorrect. We knew that, and therefore we're making corrections to that, but that did take some time to make sure that we absolutely make sure we got it right. I don't say that as any form of excuse, but to put that in the context of we have over 1,200 nominations, and what we started to do immediately was make sure every single one of them was correct in every shape or form, rather than solely focusing on the ones that anybody was raising concerns about. And so that did take some time.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got Councillor Rees next, please.
Sorry if this has been covered elsewhere, but given that project planning is of the utmost elementary nature of any kind of project, and it's not the first time anybody's faced elections, I'm just wondering why, we've got a call for a comprehensive and robust elections team plan with key milestones, etc. Yes, unfortunate personal circumstances earlier in the year notwithstanding, why wasn't there already a robust plan in place?
I think it's the right question, absolutely. So just to not so much correct, so for some within the team this was their first election. So in that respect, some within the team were going through the process for the first time. But certainly from a management perspective, it wasn't the first election that they'd run. First election they'd run here. And certainly, as I say, there is an element to which we're not special, we're not that different, but we are large geographically and rural, and have a large number of parishes that we support. And therefore, that does bring slight difference if you're used to running an election in Ipswich, for example. It's a very different experience. But there was, whilst there was a project plan and project meetings at a higher level, shall we say, that I chair, there wasn't, and hence the recommendation, a team plan within the specific service itself, and clearly that's an obvious thing that needs to be put in place, particularly where you've got, or had at the time, an inexperienced elections team, so even more important that they had that there as a backup.
Yeah.
The second question I had was that the change in system of dealing with registration of interests for councillors, there were changes that occurred at the same time as these elections. Why was that the case? Was that to do with the recent legislation? Why did all that happen at the same time as the elections?
So we changed the system of registration of interests for parishes and councillors, because it was district and parish elections, and it made sense that you know, you've got to fill in a new register to do it at that point. So that was the rationale behind that. But all parishes should have been notified and given contact details, and we have actually worked through that whole process with support from the team, and I'm really pleased to say that actually we've got the highest return rate that we've ever had on the new system for register of interest for parishes and districts. I think we're up to about 94%, which is always a role, you know, there's always an element where councillors are actually retiring or have resigned or for whatever reason. So before we were sitting about 81%. Mm-hmm. So that's a really good positive result. But yeah, the reason why we done it was because it was all out elections, and it was a sensible time to replace everything at one go.
Right. May I come back on that, please? Did it not cause any extra problems with the logistics of the whole thing, or did it actually help?
So the actual registration of interest was run by the governance team, and there was two officers assigned to that. So this was aside from the elections team, so it didn't cause any problems.
Right, okay, thanks very much. And sorry, Chair, I have a third and final question, if I may, please.
Very well.
I would just like to ask, what proportion of the training for the teams for the elections was carried out online as opposed to in person? And was there any assessment as to whether that was problematic or not, please? Thank you.
So the majority of the online training was for presiding officers and poll clerks in the polling stations themselves. I believe I'm right saying that was 100% online. That's possibly the first time we've done it that way. I'm just trying to remember now. I think it's possibly the first time we've done it that way. Obviously, the significant change that we had for these elections compared to previous ones was the introduction of voter ID, and therefore needed to make sure that poll clerks and presiding officers were confident with that process. But also we had new staff in polling stations as well, so not just confident with that new element, but confident with the whole process itself. We are exploring whether or not for future elections, whether there is some software that we could use within the polling stations for poll clerks and presiding officers to make it a lot simpler. The risk factor around that, which is why we're looking carefully at it, is that, and ironically as demonstrated this morning in this building, you're reliant upon signal. And you will be familiar with where some of our polling stations are and the fact that you can't get 1G, let alone 2 or 3. So that may not be an option, but certainly what we've planned within this action plan is to provide an online offer in terms of training, but also an additional face-to-face offer as well. Because certainly for new staff, the feedback that we had was that it would have been nice and would have given them a greater sense of assurance if they had an opportunity, once they collected their ballot boxes, so once they had all of their paperwork in front of them and had a chance to digest it, and having done the online offer, just to make sure that they were comfortable with what they were doing, particularly because, as I say, the introduction of voter ID. Having said that, and I'm hopeful nobody's now going to throw an example back in my face and say there was a problem, but the experience for the voter in the polling station was good, and it seemed to work, but we think it would be better, belt and braces, to provide both.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, just to remind you that there will be a debate, and so you can express any opinions in the debate. But I have another question from Councillor Patchett.
Thank you, Chair. I've got kind of 2 points, and hopefully I'll try and sort of merge them into one. So I think my ward particularly sort of bore the brunt of the mistakes it made, because it was my ward that had the incorrect ballot papers that had to be sort of sent out. And I think my address, I think on town I had my address on and then on district I don't think it did. That's a minor thing. But yeah, the ballot paper was definitely a big thing. And I think I was one of the ones where my nomination wasn't initially sort of on the website. One of the issues, and I don't even think this is covered actually in our review, is that I went to all of my polling stations and sort of spoke to people after they had voted, just want to reiterate that, and sort of canvassed them. And some people sort of went as a family group, so you sort of had like mum, dad, son. And we had households that had newly moved into my ward where, say, dad was registered, but mum and son were not. And even though they had put all the paperwork through for all of them at the same time, And perhaps I haven't seen it, but I don't think situations like that, did we dip into that in the review, where sort of family groups, yeah, like some people were off the register, and like, why were they off the register? So that's kind of like part one.
So no, we didn't dip into that as part of this review, not least because we haven't had a lot of reporting of that back to us. I'll look to my colleagues in a minute who I think will be able to give an explanation of that. The one thing I was going to say, and you're absolutely right, Stowe Thorney bore the brunt of some of the issues, not meant as an excuse, but just as a very practical thing. It bears the same name, both at the parish and at the district ward level. So your ballot paper, whereas normally you'd easily be able to spot, well, what's this a ballot paper for? It's for Stowe Thorney. Okay, which Stowe Thorney? That's not a situation that we experience in any other parish or ward level. They have different names. Now, to be fair to places, strangely enough, it's right, so you would expect them to have the same name. But there's just some very simple things, which means why we've had to build in and make sure we've got additional checks, because where we have staff who are not familiar with our area, and Jill wasn't here at the time, but she won't mind me mentioning the fact that both her accent and where she lives is not in Suffolk. If you don't know that actually it appears twice, then it's very easy to make a very simple mistake, and making sure that we've got those kind of things covered off for the future.
Stowe Thorney was uncommon in being district,
and that's why in the ballot papers that we had to reissue, and it's not, it will feel unusual if you're in Stowe Thorney, but it's not unusual to have to reissue some ballot papers to make a minor correction. I think it was about 600 ballot papers that we had to reissue. That in and of itself is not a significant issue. We'd rather not have to do it for obvious reasons. But yes, that transcribing from one ballot paper to the other, so that where it said, I forget which way around it was, I think it said vote for no more than 2, where it should have said vote for no more than 4, because it was correct, that language, on the other ballot paper, but wrong for that ballot paper, but they're both Stowe Thorney. So that's how we get into some of those, how we had, in particular in that area with that issue.
I mean, that's good. I mean, because I know I 100% lost votes on that, and so did sort of Colin Lay, who I sit with, because we were chatting to people, and they said, oh yeah, we did vote for you on the postal vote, but we're now moving house, and we probably won't be here when the next paper comes through. And I think there was another guy who was like a truck driver, and he said, I've already voted for you, but that paper's obviously now void, and when the next one comes in, I'll probably be away truck driving. So I know we did lose votes, but then again, so did probably some of the other candidates as well. It probably all sort of levelled out. But I only spoke to people that said, oh yes, we would have voted for you. They didn't actually say, oh no, we voted for the other guy. So I know that we definitely lost votes.
It wouldn't surprise me if people don't tend to say that. But I look to Jill, just in terms of that explanation about registration.
Yes, I was just going to pick up on your registration point, where part of a family isn't registered, although they all registered together, maybe online or put a paper form in. I mean, what happens is that your name and your details go off to DWP to be verified, and not everybody comes back as we call a green elector. Some of them come back amber or red.
We had lots of those in Mid Suffolk green electors.
and then those ones that are marked up as not as not verifying, we then have to send out further communication and inquiry forms and ask for further evidence, either a copy of your passport or your driving licence or other documents. So it may be that and you also have a deadline before the 6th day, before the day of poll, to actually make sure that your documents come back to us and you can be verified to be able to vote. So it may be that if one of the member of the families didn't actually send their forms back in time or their documents back in time, that might have been why 2 or 3 of them weren't registered, or were registered and one wasn't. But they do, although they're registered before the 11th day before poll, or the 12th day, before poll, then they've got until the 6th day before poll to actually get their forms in.
Yeah, no, thanks for the answers from both of you, because you sort of answered and put my mind a bit at ease. It would be nicer, I think, if we could. Yeah. Okay. So questions. So part 2 then. I'll forget part 1. Thanks for your answers. Part 2. Now we've all, I think, as a council, I think we almost dodged a bullet on this last election, because so we were previously the Conservative administration, then we've moved to Green. we could have almost have had, an America 2020 situation with a contested election if the Conservatives had have stayed in, because what you would have had was a kind of a council that was Conservative run, and then if the Conservatives had won it and say the Greens hadn't, we would have probably have mounted like a legal challenge because of all of the failings in the system.
Heading for a question here.
There is a question, yeah, there is a question. So what my question to you is, I have to lay some context, would be how would you have dealt, if it had been closer, if people had, if the Conservatives and the Greens had, maybe it was only like a dozen votes in it, how would you have actually have dealt with that? Because you would have had two people in a ward who would have said, well, I think I am actually the legal winner of this ward. And how would you have dealt with these legal challenges? And who actually would have you have allowed to have occupied the seat? Because we could have been in a position where actually we didn't form a council because there were legal challenges going on. How would you have dealt with that? Would you have outsourced it then? Would you have outsourced the election, a re-election, to another sort of county to run because of the failings in this county? How would you have sort of dealt with a much closer election?
Thank you, and the preamble was helpful. So no in answer to the latter bit, and fortunately I don't have to determine what happens when there's a legal process, because there's a legal process kicks in. So election petitions can be mounted where anyone believes that the result of the election was incorrect, or inaccurate, should we say, for whatever reason. You're absolutely right, we didn't receive an election petition. Election petitions are rare, touch wood, I don't ever wish to receive one, but if we did, then we would be into that process. They then are judge-led in terms of determining what was the outcome, what was the right outcome. I've been confident throughout, regardless of how tight or otherwise it was, and obviously that puts additional focus on it, but I've been confident and comfortable throughout that the results of all of the elections that were declared were correct. And that's my sole focus. I don't really care, politely, which one of you wins. In fact, I'm not allowed to care which one of you wins, nor whether it's close or not, and certainly we're familiar with that. So not this last elections, but the one before. 2 wards, one in Baber, one in Mid-Suffolk, were tied. That was determined by drawing lots. So I'm more than comfortable and familiar with the fact that we can get some very close results. But the ultimate determination on how the council is administered is a separate process, clearly made up of the numbers of the votes. And yes, as I said already, I was comfortable that the mitigations that we put in place, and there were mitigations because things went wrong, but the mitigations that we put in place made sure that the result was the correct result, i.e. the one that the voters voted for. But if somebody had brought an election petition, then we would have dealt with that accordingly.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may, it's a question concerning the EMS. We touched on training and making sure that's adequate enough, but obviously one of the problems was there was a specific bug in the system which only transpired in the last election. Are we confident that we've identified all future possible bugs, particularly we've got different elections coming up, excuse me, general election, PCC, have we tested it against all potential use cases for those different elections? And furthermore, are there any changes that we would like to see in the EMS to make those elections easier to administer? And is that work being undertaken with the supplier? And again, making sure that the testing is thorough and complete.
So I'll start, and then again, Jan and Jill want to add. So we are fortunate or misfortunate, I'm not sure which, in this country that there are about 3 providers of election software across the whole country. So there is not exactly a vast choice when it comes to running elections, and inevitably over the years we have become more and more reliant upon that software for every single part of the election. Doesn't mean we couldn't revert to paper and pencils, a bit like in the polling station if we had to, but we have become more and more reliant upon it. The bug, you're absolutely right, we did discover a bug that was not unique to us. It applied across all the software across the country, and they've subsequently issued a patch to fix it. I would say that the reason we discovered that is because we had a different problem. So in trying to fix a previous problem, not a software-related problem, we discovered the bug. That was the one that led to a number of candidates being described as local Conservative on the statement of persons nominated when they weren't. That was automatically filled by the system, not by us, which, as you can imagine, when you're not even in that field, comes as a bit of a surprise. So that bit has been fixed. I'm confident in the software supply. I'm also more confident in the fact that they have clearly recognised that they have a relationship with us that they want to sustain, and it's not good for their reputation either when a council has issues, regardless of the level of software issue or not. And so they've been all over us, politely, to make sure that we stay with them for the future. And at the moment we have no intention of changing necessarily, but clearly all contracts reach a point and we go through a procurement exercise. And then the more fundamental one for me is making sure that our staff are very familiar with the software and understand how it works. Because having said there's only a few providers, they're slightly different in terms of how they present. Obviously it's the same election that ultimately has to be delivered, but they do it in ever so slightly different ways. And so we've already had additional training for our staff on the software, and that will carry on. And similarly, the software provider has offered to second some of their staff into our team for a period of time if we would like, which we are taking them up on that offer. Jill or Jan, did you want to add?
Thank you. Yes,
If I can just come back just on the operational side, we have fortnightly meetings with Democracy Counts, with their IT guys and our IT guys and some of our staff to go through the issues. We're planning very shortly to set up the test election so that they can thoroughly test that out with ourselves ahead, and we're hoping to do that in the next couple of weeks. As I say, and our staff have undertaken lots more training with them, and we've got lots more planned.
And I should add, whilst doesn't capture the same level of attention, obviously, we have run elections since and are regularly running elections during the year because we have by-elections at parish level and also neighbourhood plan referendums. So we are continuing to use the software for those purposes as well.
Sorry, just the other part to the question about any future changes to the system that we might require. Are we going to request any, or is that?
So we have a wish list, and that goes forward with our fortnightly meetings. So we're putting down what we see as changes that we'd like them to make, and they review those and come back to us and tell us where they are with it, what is possible and what is not. So yeah, we're constantly looking at what we can do, and also we're also looking at the speed of the delivery as well of the system, which has also been a problem in the past. So that is also being investigated.
And like all of their clients, we're part of the user group, so it's not just us putting in our wish list, it's all of the users for all the other clients.
All right. I have a couple more. Councillor Register has another question.
Actually, it follows on from what you were just talking about. So if there's an update to the software, either a bug fix or a feature addition because you've requested something, are EMS running both functional and behavioural driven tests to ensure that there are no regressions in the software? So by adding this feature, you actually break something else, which is now becoming quite common in software development, and ensures that every time you add a bug, you don't break something else because everything works as it did before, except those bits that have been fixed by the bug or feature addition. And have you raised? And if you don't quite comprehend what I mean, I'm happy to elucidate. But would that be something you would take up with the suppliers?
I was just going to say that when any of the EMS providers, before they actually send us the data to upload, it is robustly tested, and I can understand exactly what you're saying, but they have to assure us that it is, because it is put straight into a live system, because all of the changes are to do with legislation. So that we do get their guarantee that they do robustly test it before we get it. There is a large update coming in October because of the changes in absent voting, and we all know that this will have been tested. But yes, I can understand exactly what you're saying, and we just we just have to keep testing the system. And we, as well as the meetings that Jan's mentioned, they also have meetings with me every Friday now, every Friday morning to go through it. And also the EMS providers have been providing even extra training, and I've got another one this afternoon to take me through the system, because as Arthur said, they all do the same, the main three, but they're all slightly different in their way of thinking. And I have been, and other providers I've used all that myself, Express, but Democracy Counts is a new one to me, but they have been very good in providing extra training for us all, and as well as me, they are giving extra training to the staff, to give them confidence.
Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. As this is a public meeting, it suddenly crossed my mind that the big question for a lot of voters was voter ID. Many people made lots of comments. How big a problem was that during these last elections, and what should we be doing to prepare for the next election? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
So I think I'd probably say we have ended up focusing on what went wrong, and rightly so. What we've not focused on particularly is what went right, and I would say voter ID was in that category because we planned for the worst and didn't experience it. So very few problems in the polling stations. Some anomalies, if you like, identification that you would have assumed would be allowable, but isn't on the list of allowable identification and therefore needed to be turned away. So things like police warrant cards. It's an interesting exercise when you have a member of staff having to tell a police officer, no, sorry, you can't vote. Not with that identification, you need to come back with a different set of identification. But government have taken away some of those lessons, and the meeting we had, as I say, last week with the Electoral Commission, they are revisiting the list of approved identification. That's good, that's positive. What that also means for future poll clerks and presiding officers is that's an even longer list of things you need to check through to see whether or not it's a valid ID. But it would appear, based on the numbers, that we had a relatively positive experience, or rather voters had a relatively positive experience in terms of voter ID, but I'm very conscious that we had a district and parish level turnout, not a parliamentary election level turnout, and so there will be voters, I'm sure, who only vote at parliamentary, who have managed to miss the fact that the law has changed. So yes, I'll take this opportunity again as a public meeting to reiterate it. Every election, you need to bring along one of the valid forms of identification. If you don't have a valid form of identification, we can provide you with it. But you need to apply sufficiently in advance to allow us time to be able to process the application, to be able to provide it to you. Or you can have a postal vote instead, and where you don't have to worry at all about voter ID. But clearly that's a choice for the voters. But no, it would appear in all of our polling stations that the message had been heard and that people did either come along with ID or went back and got it and came back again. Very few people were turned away, and we didn't use, which was one of the suggestions from the Electoral Commission, we didn't use greeters, largely because we would have struggled to be able to employ yet another 180 staff to stand at the door of a polling station to ask somebody as they walked in rather than ask them when they walk in. So we don't think we had many actually turned away before they even arrived, if you see what I mean. It would only be if they happened to have read the poster and then went away themselves.
Can I just come back? Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I think, can I just have a quick word first? I was just going to say that I remember sort of reading about voting that there was a suggestion by somebody that somebody whose ID had already been accepted might be allowed to vouch for somebody else. Is that a no-go?
Absolutely not, no. And this is one of the difficulties in terms of staff as well, because you can imagine, particularly where we tend to have a poll clerk and a presiding officer from that village, they know who you are, but they still need to see the identification. And that's quite helpful, as returning officers, quite helpful, because that means everything is very black and white. We don't get into this situation of vouching. I think one of the issues was raised with me more recently, not at the time, around a husband vouching for their wife. Well, no, I don't know it's your wife. And even if I do know it's your wife, you still need to produce the identification. And it's not my rules, we're just there to administer it. But no, definitely not. Absolutely no.
Did Councillor McLaren have a bit more there on the end?
Thank you, Chair. Given that we need to be starting early for the whichever the next election is it possible to encourage ward members and parish councils to start some sort of message very early on and continue with that message? Thank you.
I mean, we can do. I can take that forward. One of the things that we are going to do, which is part of my meeting with the media team, is that we will start the campaign again, and the Electoral Commission definitely will start the campaign again for voter ID. And actually, last Friday, I went to visit the storage, the depot, where all the election equipment is kept, and in there are all the banners all rolled up that we used about voter ID. So we said, oh great, they're all in good condition, we'll use them again, so we're going to get those out. That was one of the things. We'll use that again to put out where they were last time, but there will be in our campaign again for voter ID, so it won't be that it'll just been forgotten and it'll all be about absent voting this year. We'll put that back as well. And as Arthur did say, the Electoral Commission and DLUC are looking to expand the list of acceptable forms of ID to bring to the polling station.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? We seem to have had a good, yet another one?
Really short one. A really short one. If Labour are doing something publicly like the climate change workshops, can we not have a banner saying, have you got your voter ID? Just to remind people.
We absolutely can. I think the challenge always is which of the particular messages we want to encourage people to focus on at any given event. But the principle, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, I'd just like a little guidance from the monitoring officer. My detailed running order doesn't suggest that there should be a debate, but I think people should have the opportunity to express any opinions that don't fit within the general description of questions before we move to a vote. Is that all right?
Yes, Chair. It's a normal committee, so it's questions and debate.
Anybody like to say anything before we move to a vote? I think all the concerns that people have, I think, are very largely emerged from the questioning, and I think thanks to the returning officer, very detailed answers. And so I have Councillor Whitehead.
Yes, thank you. I think more sort of observations rather than questions, so I sort of bided my time. Being a councillor here, I think I've been through 4 elections, district council elections, and it felt more different recently because going back to the early years, like 2011, the electoral team, I think there was an electoral manager and various assistants that between them sort of had 20 years experience each and sort of knew the mid-Suffolk wards and parishes like the back of their hands. And unfortunately, you lose that experience and, you can't replicate it. So I think the issues with Stowe Thornley, that sort of thing that someone who sort of, person who knew the area really well would have got on that straight away. So if you can't sort of replicate experience straight away, I do wonder whether we ought to be careful not to understaff this area. I'm guessing back again in 2011, there was 2 lots of staffing. There was a Baber electoral team and the Mid-Suffolk team, and it's fine to be able to say, now we pay for half a chief executive or half a Section 151 officer, but I think on the election side, because it is an administrative exercise, an academic exercise, it's crucial that we don't try and cut corners there. And if anything, we need more staff than we had, because say, you can't replace 20 or 30 years of experience. And again, I've worked through 2 community governance reviews, and the contrast between those 2 were really quite stark. The first one, the electoral team, they put the wellies on and actually gone and looked round the area, walked the ward when they're looking at boundaries and things like that. And then again, they were leading members on that. Second time round, it just felt it had been done as a sort of Google Earth exercise, and they're pretty clueless as to say where the Winnes and Stowmarket boundaries lay, and you know, all sorts of issues arose from that. So I think what I'm trying to say is let's not cut corners and make sure it's adequately staffed.
Thank you, Chair. I think sometimes when you do make a mistake, which we have, a good thorough review turns over all the stones and we learn from that. So as far as I can perceive from the whole process, very positive, great to see the thoroughness in which it's been undertaken, and I think it's been a really worthwhile exercise.
It's just, this is just almost a suggestion really. On page 46 under resource, it's referring to the accessibility and any additional resources that may be required and who might carry out those reviews, if you like. I was just wondering whether there'd be scope for our locality officers to help with that at all, as and when they visit the wards, especially out in the villages where most of the polling stations take place in the village halls and other buildings where elections, which are used as polling stations. Thank you. That's just a comment. Thanks.
Yes, please.
So we are going to be undertaking a polling district review, and it's planned for later in the year. One of the first things we're going to do is survey all the previous presiding officers and polling inspectors, but also go out to town and parish liaison groups to talk to the clerks, because actually they know who's in their village, and the ward councillors and the parish councils. So as part of that consultation, everybody will be involved in giving some feedback, and the plan is to go round to those polling stations that we're not so familiar with, to have a look and make ourselves familiar with all of that. So a lot of work to be done, but that is in the plan going forward for that polling district review.
Anybody else? Yes, Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Chair, I just wished to commend the returning officer for being so prompt when the problem occurred, and contacting the Electoral Commission, and obviously we had the review. I think that was very commendable, and we've had I think a very positive outcome to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Patchett.
Try not to turn this into the Patchett show, but anyway. So again, I'm just looking at the sort of chart at the moment, and there's quite a lot of red on there. And also, I'd like to agree with sort of councillors Wyman and Whitehead that yes, I think that it is good that we do a review. So yeah, I'd like to sort of second that as well. And also with Councillor Whitehead, yeah, perhaps we do need local knowledge, and we need a mid-Suffolk electors team, and we need a Baber electors team. Perhaps this is one place where we do need to divide. So again, I'm just looking at the not starteds. What did I don't know if anyone else asked, but did we actually put a time frame on that? Because we've got an up and coming sort of general election. The not starteds and the reds and the ambers. What is there a time frame to turn them green or amber?
So, as I previously said, this is the first 2 weeks. The next task for us is to go through and actually put dates in as to when we need to get those started by, when we need to meet the milestones within that. So, there is an elections project plan which will come behind that, but the plan is to start them all as soon as we practically can. But with the prioritisation at the moment, we have to get the annual canvass out of the way, polling district review started, and get the legislation and the new boundary changes into the system so that we're up and running. So that's our main focus at the moment. But work is, for reassurance, work is going on about elections. As Arthur has alluded to, we're already planning and looking at new venues for the next election, looking at the logistics behind that, what we need to do, working out how many ballot boxes we do. So that's all in. We've booked the polling stations. There's only 3 that we've got a query with. for across both districts. So we are ahead, and it is being done. It's just a matter of putting the metrics into that plan so that you can see it. But it is all going on.
Can I reply to that? It's just, I know, like with myself personally, I am sort of, if I've got a whole list of jobs, just because of the way my brain works, I never do anything until there's a deadline and like the last minute. And yeah, I'll admit that I'm guilty of that. So I am turning this into the Patrick show as well, aren't I? I guess the problem is if we don't put like a timeline on it, you know, perhaps people just go, yeah, okay, well, you know, the people that are responsible for it might actually just go, hey, yeah, I'll do this next big sort of crocodile and I won't deal with this. Even if we just put an arbitrary on it of just say like 31st of March, just put something on it, because how can you measure performance with no actual end goal? You know, there's certain criteria you need to hit, because you've put red, amber, greens on it, that's a measure of performance. If you don't actually put a deadline on it, I want this done by, you know, we can't measure that performance. So I think the very next thing we need to do, I think you probably already said that we're going to do, we've got to put done by on it, because I know how people work, and people, if there's no date, people won't do it. They'll just brush it off.
Would you like to put in a word?
Yeah, there are three, well, there's probably more than that, but there's three elements that I think are fundamentally missing from this and that I'm looking for in the next iteration. One is the accountable officer for each of the tasks. One is the deadline for each of the tasks. And then the third is the interdependencies, which I suppose in effect is the prioritisation to some degree, but it's how these different actions relate to each other, because clearly some do, some don't. And I think that would be helpful, because in answer to somebody's question earlier, I made the point, I suppose, that some of these actually relate only to our next district and parish elections, which we know are not for 4 years, but you can't see that from this document. And that would help then the project team in particular, but also the project board, in terms of assessing this by exception, to be able to say, okay, that one doesn't need to be done yet, doesn't mean it doesn't need to ever be done, and certainly doesn't need to be left to the last possible minute, but at least then you can see the flow. So I'm expecting some kind of Gantt chart, to be honest, is going to be the next iteration. But what we wanted to get you is the first iteration and hear your thoughts. It is very deliberately a draft that will continue to evolve, and I'm fairly sure there'll be further government legislation in the next 4 years that will add yet more to the elections picture. If I can, just in terms of while I've got the floor, and answer to Councillor Whitehead's question, I don't know what the elections teams looked like in terms of numbers back in 2011, 2012, but I'm fairly sure you're right, and that there would have been probably a team that's nearly double what we've got now, possibly not quite double, and certainly would have had decades worth of experience in it, both in terms of elections knowledge, which is clearly important, but also in terms of patch knowledge, which is also important. And certainly elections knowledge is the thing that we had an absence of as we went through the last elections, and therefore have training plans in place in order to build up. But I'm particularly grateful that you raised it while the Section 151 officer sat to my right, because I think you're right, the team needs to grow, and therefore there will be a cost implication to the authorities.
Thank you. Anybody else? If not, I've just a few observations really. Clearly, these elections weren't weren't our finest hour, so to speak. But I think it was reassuring soon after the election to hear a clear statement that the election and the outcome of the election had been was satisfactory and safe. I think was the term that was used. And I think the plan we've got in front of us at the moment it's a checklist of all the recommendations, and that's a good start. But the officers, all of the officers, have assured me earlier on this morning that the structure and interconnection and indeed the deadlines and so on, that work is going on, and there will be another plan which possibly we'll need to look at again briefly next time to see that it's all going forward comfortably and well. And so if nobody's got anything else that they wanted to say, then I will ask for the vote to be held on noting this the report and the plan? Yeah. Yeah, well, we do need a proposer and a seconder for this, apparently. Right, we have Councillor Dowling and Rep Patchett and others.
Thank you, Chair. That vote is now in progress on ModGov. Thank you, Chair. That is 9 votes for. That's unanimous.
Thank you. That's unanimous then. I don't think it would be a good plan to have a break halfway through the other main item, so I suggest that we take a 5-minute or so break now. What have we got? 52 minutes of that. Shall we? Right, are we? No. Right, the other main item of our business, we'll be discussing a report which is entirely confidential, so I propose that we move straight to that process. And so I'm proposing that we exclude the public, and the proposal is to consider whether, pursuant to Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, the public should be excluded from the meeting for the business specified below, on the grounds that if the public were present during this item, it is likely that there would be the disclosure to them of exempt information as indicated against the item. The author of the report proposed to be considered in Part 2 of the agenda is satisfied that the public interest in maintaining the exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. Can I have a proposal to go into closed session? It's Councillor Register, Councillor McLaren. Thank you. Right, show of hands, those in favour? Everybody? Thank you. Thank you. Right. Are we coming up for an electronic vote? Just a moment. Can we hear the can we hear what we're now going to vote on?
Chair, do you want me to assist with that? That to note the recommendations in the report and that a future report be brought back to Joint Audit and Standards Committee?
Yeah, I think that's what Bethany's working on. She's just asking us to read it back.
Did you have a timescale, which I don't think you've agreed on?
Any views? 2 months, 4 months? 6 months. Right, I would second 2 months. Next meeting, in other words. Right, you able to read that now?
Yep, so it's to note the contents of the report and confidential Appendix A, and that a future report be brought back to the Joint Audit and Standards Committee within 2 months.
All right.
Thank you, Chair. That vote is now in progress on ModGov. Councillor Rees, can I take your vote verbally? Can I take your vote verbally? Councillor Marriott, can I take your vote verbally? Can I take your vote verbally then? Thank you, Chair. That is 9 votes for. That's unanimous.
We have the forward plan. I'll find that. And we've obviously adding on to that what we've just asked for. And are there any other comments on the forward plan? Right. No problem. Do we need a vote on that? No vote on that. Good. Right. Thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you at the next meeting on the 27th of November. That concludes the meeting.